Lucas, a reclusive farmer, believed that everything in his life was predictable. But that morning, he was proven wrong when he entered his barn and saw something that defied all logic. Among the newborn puppies of his loyal dog, Luna, lay a human baby. The small community was thrown into chaos as the news spread. How could such a thing happen? Lucas, known for his arrogance and coldness, couldn't believe what he was seeing. He was a man who had avoided the company of others ever since he lost his beloved wife, Olivia. The pain had turned him into a shadow of his former self, isolated on his farm, surrounded only by his animals and his faithful housekeeper, Grace. Luna had been heavily pregnant, and Lucas had made sure she had a safe spot in the barn for the birth. But as he now stood before her, with her newborn puppies and the baby lying among them, he felt as though he had stepped into a nightmare. He knelt down and examined the tiny creature lying next to the puppies. Its skin was soft and pink, a stark contrast to the furry bundles beside it. The baby moved, breathed calmly, and seemed perfectly alive. Lucas's mind raced. Was this some cruel joke? Had someone left the child here? But who would do such a thing? Just then, he heard a noise from the back corner of the barn, a soft, muffled sob. Instinctively, Lucas reached for the old shotgun, leaning against the wall, and sharply addressed the darkness. "Who's there?" A stifled breath, then hesitant footsteps. Out of the shadows emerged a young woman, her clothes stained with blood, her face pale with exhaustion. She raised her hands, a pleading look in her eyes. "Please, I just wanted him to have a chance," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Lucas stared at her. "Is this your child?" His voice was rough, filled with disbelief. The woman nodded and began to cry softly. I had nowhere else to go. My boyfriend, he didn't want the baby. He said he'd get rid of it once it was born." Lucas felt anger rising within him. "And you just left it here? With my dog?" The woman sobbed, clutching herself. "I didn't know what to do. She looked so gentle. I thought maybe she'd take care of him." Her voice broke. "I was afraid he'd find us." Lucas pressed his lips together. He had never been the type to involve himself in other people's affairs, but something about this situation wouldn't let him go. The desperation in her eyes, the helpless baby. Slowly, he lowered the gun and sighed heavily. "Come with me to the house." The woman blinked in surprise. "What?" "This barn is no place for you or your child," Lucas said firmly. "Come with me before I change my mind." Hesitantly, she stepped closer, her movements cautious, as if afraid he might turn her away. She gently picked up the baby, who was sleeping peacefully. Lucas watched her for a moment, then turned and marched toward the farmhouse. When they reached the porch, Grace was standing in the doorway, her eyes widening at the sight of Lucas with the stranger and the baby. "What in the world?" "I'll explain later," Lucas said, brushing past her. He pointed to the couch. "Sit down. You look like you're about to collapse." The woman sank onto the cushions, her knees trembling, holding the baby close. Lucas turned to Grace. "We need warm water, towels, and if you still have any of Olivia's clothes, bring them." Grace studied him for a moment, then nodded and disappeared into the next room. The young woman looked up at Lucas, tears glistening in her eyes. "Thank you." Lucas merely shrugged. "Don't thank me yet." Amelia couldn't believe she was actually inside Lucas's house. The man known for his coldness and aloofness had let her in, a stranger with a newborn in her arms. The warmth of the room, the crackling of the fireplace, and the comforting smell of fresh bread Grace had prepared felt surreal to her. Lucas sat across from her, arms crossed, his expression still stern. He was sizing her up as if trying to gauge the truth of her story. "So you're saying your boyfriend didn't want the child?" he finally asked, his voice rough. Amelia nodded, her fingers gently stroking Arthur's tiny hand. "He said a child would ruin everything, that I had to get rid of it." Her voice faltered and she swallowed hard. "But I couldn't. I knew if I stayed, he'd hurt us both. So I ran." Lucas was silent for a long time, while Grace, who was bustling in the kitchen, kept casting suspicious glances in their direction. Finally, Lucas spoke again. "And you thought it was a good idea to leave your child in my barn?" "I didn't know where else to go," Amelia murmured softly. I was afraid to take him with me when I could barely stand myself. Luna, she was just there, so gentle with her puppies. I thought maybe she'd keep him warm until I could figure something out. Lucas snorted and shook his head. A damn poor solution. Amelia flinched, but Grace interrupted the tense silence by placing a steaming bowl of broth on the table. Here, girl, you look like you're about to keel over. Gratefully, Amelia took the bowl and began to eat slowly. The warmth spread through her weakened body, and she realized just how long it had been since she'd had a proper meal. As she ate, Lucas's gaze kept drifting to Arthur, who was sleeping peacefully in her arms. What's his name? Lucas asked after a while, without looking directly at her. Arthur, Amelia replied softly, tenderly stroking his cheek. Lucas only nodded, his face expressionless. But Grace noticed a faint glimmer in his eyes. She had known Lucas long enough to recognize that something was stirring within him, that he was beginning to wonder what he was supposed to do with this woman and her child. Night fell over the ranch. Amelia was given a small room to sleep in. It was modest but clean, and as she wrapped Arthur in a blanket and sat on the bed, she felt safe for the first time in months. Yet deep down, she was still afraid. Edgar would come looking for her. She couldn't stay here forever. Lucas remained by the fireplace for a long time, staring into the flames, his face thoughtful. He was not a man who took responsibility for others. Not anymore. Yet he knew that Amelia and Arthur were in danger. He leaned back in his chair. He had always sworn to keep his distance from the world, but perhaps it was time to reconsider that vow. The next morning, the atmosphere on the ranch was calmer, but no less tense. Amelia woke early, Arthur's soft whimpers rousing her from a restless sleep. She gently stroked his face and carefully got up, trying not to startle him. The little boy looked up at her, his big eyes shining in the morning light. She left the room to find Grace, but as she stepped outside, she saw Lucas in the yard. He was already up, his sleeves rolled up as he checked on the livestock. Amelia hesitated, then cautiously approached. Lucas noticed her and gave her a curt nod. Did you sleep? He asked bluntly. A little, Amelia replied softly. Lucas studied her for a moment before turning back to his work. I'm going into town today to get supplies. You'll stay here. Grace will look after you. Amelia started to protest, but Lucas cut her off with a look. I'm not in the mood for arguments. Just stay here. Amelia watched him as he walked away. She knew she should be grateful, but she couldn't help feeling like a burden. Still, she knew she had no choice. When Lucas arrived in town, he quickly took care of his errands. But as he was about to leave the store, he heard a familiar voice behind him. Lucas, long time no see. Lucas slowly turned and saw an old acquaintance standing before him, Sheriff Donovan. The man studied him carefully. I heard you've got visitors at your ranch. A woman and a baby. Lucas's expression hardened. And if I do? The sheriff raised an eyebrow. There's someone looking for her, a man named Edgar. He's been asking around. Lucas clenched his fists, his blood boiling. And what exactly does he want? He says she ran off with his child. He wants her back. Lucas felt his protective instincts kick in. Amelia was in danger, and he wouldn't let Edgar find her. He took a deep breath and looked the sheriff squarely in the eye. She's not his property. The sheriff studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. Be careful, Lucas. This man doesn't give up easily. Lucas already knew that, and he also knew that the time to act was approaching. The sun was just rising over the vast fields of the ranch as Lucas stood on the porch, his expression tense. The conversation with Sheriff Donovan weighed heavily on his mind. Edgar knew Amelia was here. It was only a matter of time before he tried to take her back. Inside, Amelia sat at the kitchen table with Grace, sipping tea. Arthur was peacefully sleeping in a makeshift cradle Grace had skillfully fashioned from an old laundry basket. Amelia had dark circles under her eyes and her hands trembled slightly as she held the cup. Lucas noticed this as he walked in. You didn't sleep well, he stated matter-of-factly. Amelia nodded silently. I can't stop thinking. Edgar won't just give up. He'll come back. Lucas pulled up a chair and sat across from her. I won't let him hurt you or Arthur. She looked up at him, fear in her eyes but also a glimmer of hope. But can you hold him off? He has money, connections. Lucas leaned back, his gaze cool. I have my own ways of dealing with problems like this. Grace, who had been silent until now, cleared her throat. Lucas, we need to be careful. The town is already talking. Lucas rolled his eyes. When has the town ever not talked? Amelia sighed and gently stroked Arthur's tiny face. I don't want anyone to get hurt because of me. Maybe I should just... Lucas's voice was sharp. You're not going anywhere. The silence in the room was heavy. Finally, Grace broke it by standing up and rummaging through the pantry with a determined look. Then we should prepare. Amelia gave her a questioning look. What do you mean? Grace smiled faintly. If this Edgar comes back, we should make sure we're ready. Lucas may be strong, but he's not invincible. Lucas snorted. I can take care of myself. Still, Grace replied, gathering supplies, it doesn't hurt to take some precautions. Amelia looked at her and nodded slowly, then turned to Lucas. Thank you for protecting us. Lucas held her gaze. I'm doing what needs to be done. Outside, a strong wind began to blow. It wouldn't be long before trouble arrived. The next morning, Lucas began inspecting the perimeter of the ranch. He checked the fences, reinforced the barn doors, and made sure the weapons were within reach. Amelia watched him from a distance, wondering how long she and Arthur could continue to be a burden to him and Grace. As Lucas worked, an old friend showed up, Jacob, a former rancher who lived in town. Lucas, I heard you've got visitors, he said cautiously. Lucas's eyes narrowed. Stop with the hints. If you know something, say it. Jacob sighed. Edgar was in town. He's asking questions, and he's angry. Lucas's jaw tightened. He knew it was only a matter of time, but he had no intention of going down without a fight. Meanwhile, Amelia tried to make herself useful. She helped Grace with the daily chores, but her mind kept wandering. Should she run before Edgar arrived? But when she looked at Arthur, she knew she couldn't keep running. She had to face this, with Lucas by her side. The hours passed slowly as Lucas continued to secure the ranch. Amelia spent the time talking to Grace about her past. The older woman listened patiently as Amelia recounted the horrors she had endured at Edgar's hands, the slaps, the threats, the constant fear. Grace placed a hand on her shoulder. You're stronger than you think, dear, and you're not alone anymore. That night, Lucas stayed up late, his thoughts swirling about what was to come. He had made plans, scouted escape routes, and considered possible allies. He knew an open confrontation would be dangerous, but Edgar wasn't going to disappear on his own. Then he heard it, a motor in the distance. His hand instinctively went to the gun at his belt. Edgar was close. Lucas rushed to the porch and peered into the darkness. The headlights of a vehicle cut through the night. Amelia, who had just stepped out of her room, froze. Her eyes widened in fear. He's here, she whispered. Lucas's expression hardened. Go inside. Lock the door. But Amelia didn't move. Grace came out of the kitchen and saw the car's lights as well. She grabbed Amelia's arm. Come on, dear. Lucas drew his gun and stepped off the porch onto the yard. The vehicle came to an abrupt halt, kicking up dust. For a moment, everything was still. Then the door opened, and a dark figure emerged. Lucas, the man said in a slow, dragging voice. Lucas tensed. Edgar, you have no business here. A cold smile played on Edgar's lips. You have something that belongs to me. Lucas stood his ground. She's not property, Edgar, and you're going to leave this land now. Edgar laughed softly. And if I don't? Lucas raised his gun slightly. Then you won't live to regret it. Edgar stepped closer. You're willing to die for a woman you barely know? Lucas's gaze turned icy. I'm willing to do whatever it takes to protect her. The night was still. A moment of decision hung in the air. Then Edgar drew his gun. The cold night air hung heavy over the ranch as Lucas stood facing Edgar, his expression tense. The car's headlights cast long shadows on the dusty ground. Amelia and Grace watched the scene from the window, their hearts pounding. Edgar held a gun in his hand, his gaze calm but his eyes burning with anger. You really think you can protect her from me? Edgar's voice was dangerously quiet. Lucas squared his shoulders. I know I can. His own gun remained trained on Edgar, ready for the slightest wrong move. Amelia struggled to breathe. She couldn't let this escalate further. With trembling hands, she opened the door and stepped outside. Edgar, please, just go. Edgar laughed coldly. So that's your solution? Just ask me to leave? You belong to me, Amelia, and you're coming with me. Lukas took a step forward, his voice low and firm. The days when you could order her around are over. Edgar shook his head. You have no idea who you're dealing with. He shifted his gun slightly as if testing the trigger. I could just take you out of the way right now. Then do it, Lukas said unflinching. But you should know I'm not alone. At that moment, Sheriff Donovan emerged from the darkness, accompanied by two deputies. Edgar McCall, the sheriff called out firmly, drop your weapon and step back. Edgar froze. His eyes darted from Lukas to Amelia, then to the sheriff. He hadn't expected the police to show up. His face twisted in anger. This isn't over, he spat before slowly lowering his gun. The deputies moved in and took Edgar into custody. Amelia felt her knees give way as the tension drained from her body. Lukas was immediately by her side, holding her up before she could collapse. It's over, he murmured softly. Sheriff Donovan approached and nodded at Lukas. Well done. We've been looking for a chance to catch Edgar for a long time. Now we've got him. Amelia could hardly believe it was really over. Tears welled up in her eyes as she looked at Arthur, who was peacefully sleeping inside. She was finally free. Lukas felt something shift within him. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel alone. He looked at Amelia and knew this was just the beginning, for both of them. The morning sun bathed the ranch in golden light as Amelia stood on the porch with Arthur in her arms. The fresh breeze brushed her face, and for the first time in a long time, she felt completely safe. Edgar was in custody, and the shadows of the past were beginning to fade. Lukas stepped beside her, his hands on his hips. You seem calmer, he observed. Amelia nodded and smiled faintly. It feels like I can finally breathe. She looked down at Arthur, who was reaching his tiny hands toward the morning sun. He'll grow up without fear. Lukas watched her for a moment, then nodded slowly. You have a place here, Amelia, if you want to stay. Her eyes widened slightly. Are you serious? He leaned on the railing and snorted in amusement. I'm not a man of many words, but I know this feels right. You, Arthur, me, we have something worth preserving. Amelia felt her heart race. I never thought I'd find a future in a place like this. Lukas placed a hand on her shoulder. Sometimes life finds its own way. The weeks passed and Amelia began to settle into ranch life. She helped Grace in the kitchen, tended to the animals, and watched Arthur grow. Lukas was always nearby, watchful, protective, and increasingly, she saw something in his eyes that went beyond mere care. One evening, as the stars sparkled brightly above the ranch, they sat together on the porch. Arthur was already asleep, and the silence between them was comfortable, familiar. Lukas, Amelia began softly, do you think we can really do this? Be a real family? He turned to her, his expression serious. I know we can. It doesn't take blood to make a family. It just takes people who are there for each other. She looked at him for a moment, then took his hand. Then let's give it a try. A gentle smile appeared on Lukas's face, and as he squeezed her hand, Amelia knew she had finally found her place. Not just on the ranch, but in a life she could never have dreamed of. The ranch, once just Lukas's refuge, had become their shared home. A new beginning built on hope, trust, and a love that was slowly but surely finding its place. The days passed, and with each sunrise, the bond between them grew. Amelia no longer felt like a stranger on the ranch, but a part of it. Grace taught her how to bake bread, use herbs for medicinal purposes, and the importance of patience in life. Lukas, on the other hand, taught her how to work with the horses, repair fences, and understand the land. One day, as Lukas walked out of the barn with Arthur in his arms, Amelia realized how far they had come. Arthur squealed happily, reaching his tiny hands toward Lukas's face. Lukas chuckled softly and kissed Arthur's forehead. The sight warmed Amelia's heart. It's beautiful to see him so happy, she said softly as Lukas approached. He has a family that loves him. That makes all the difference. Amelia looked up at him. And me? Lukas was silent for a moment, then gently lifted her chin. You're my family, Amelia. You and Arthur. You've become my home. Tears filled her eyes, but this time they were tears of joy. She felt Lucas take her hands and hold them tightly, as if to assure her he would never let go. "I love you, Amelia," he said finally, his voice firm. A soft laugh escaped her lips before she replied, "I love you too, Lucas." In that moment, Amelia knew she was exactly where she was meant to be, on this ranch with Lucas and Arthur, as a family. The past could no longer haunt her. She had begun a new life, one filled with love, warmth, and security. The wind whispered softly through the fields as the three of them walked into the house together, ready to embrace their new life to the fullest.